and welcome. I'm Sophia Toma Cruz, and you're watching Rappler Talk. Today, we are here with Greg Poling, Senior Fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., and Director for the Asian Maritime Transparency Initiative. Sorry. Greg co authored a report that recently came out called Pulling Back the Curtain on China's Maritime Militia, which gives an overall profile of the ownership, nature, and support structure of these vessels, which up until recently was a really big question. It's a really great report that goes into detail on the Chinese maritime militia. So let's just dive right in, Greg. The report, as I said, provided a detailed profile of the Chinese maritime militia using many primary sources, which up until now, I think was a big question for a lot of people. So can you tell us, just to start off, what you found out, and I guess how do we know that a vessel is indeed a maritime militia vessel? And hi,
That
that's
was one of
okay.
my co-authors. I apologize.
Oh, maybe she should join us for the interview. Um, yeah. So as I was saying, maybe you can start off with a brief summary of what you found out throughout the course of this really deep research, and you can start off also with telling us how do we know that a vessel is a Chinese maritime militia vessel? Are there telltale signs that people should be watching out for?
Sure, thank you, Sophia. So the way the report's structured, we have two groups of vessels, and in the back you'll find an appendix. There's the confirmed militia vessels. There's 122 of those, and they only involve one of two different factors that we look for. Either A, they are named as militia vessels in Chinese sources. So these would be Chinese government documents, Chinese government regulations, Chinese news stories, etc. And that, accounted for a pretty substantial number of these. The second is if they were at a known militia deployment. So if they were involved in the standoff at Whitson Reef or Julian Felipe Reef early this year, if they were involved in one of the months-long deployments around Pagasa Island, and so on. And in those cases, it's pretty easy to tell because you look at the same vessel sitting there for weeks or sometimes months on end, and they never fish. And it's painfully obvious that if they were a commercial fisherman, they would be bankrupt by now because they never put their nets in the water. So those are the only two factors that got a boat on the confirmed list. There's a second list of about 52 vessels that we think are likely militia boats but need other research. And those are kind of a more detailed methodology. These are things like they receive subsidies that are higher than what a comparable boat would in China. They operate in suspicious ways. They're linked to other known militia boats, or maybe in one of the more interesting cases, they're understaffed. So if you have a boat that normally needs a crew of 20, and this boat only has a crew of 8, that's a good hint that they're not really fishing. They don't need to pay as many people because they're not pulling up nets.
Yeah, I think one really interesting point too about the report is that it really went into detail about who might be the owners of these vessels. Um, and you mentioned in the report that for some of the vessels you were able to find like real people who own these, and then sometimes they're linked to companies. Can you give us a brief overview of who these people are, what might their background be, and why would they be interested in owning these sorts of ships?
Yeah. So there's two fleets in the South China Sea. And when I'm using these terms, I'm going to be using the exact translations of the Chinese terminology. We're not making any language up here. There's what China calls professional maritime militia fishing vessels, and those operate out of Hainan province. Particularly, most of them are registered to Sansha City, the Chinese city in the Paracel Islands on Woody Island. And those are mostly owned and operated by a state-owned company, the Sansha Fisheries Development Company. So that professional fleet, the one that most often is doing things like harassing foreign government vessels or protecting Chinese oil and gas surveys, those are state-owned. The other fleet, what China calls the Spratly Backbone Fishing Fleet, these are owned by commercial operators, or at least people who used to be commercial operators. And the government has paid them to either build their boat to the specifications needed for militia work or to upgrade their existing boats for militia work. And in that case, that fleet operates out of Guangdong province, 5 ports in particular in Guangdong. And it doesn't try very hard to hide its activity. So most of these are individual Chinese business people who might own 1, 2, 3 boats, and it's a pretty good way to make money. There are a handful of examples where a larger company linked to the state. In one case, linked to the Department of Agriculture, in another case, owned by a delegate to the National People's Congress, owns a whole bunch of boats. But for the most part, these are kind of individual business people who recognized a good opportunity when they saw it. The state will pay you to build a boat. They'll pay for the boat, they'll pay for the loan interest, and then they'll pay you every day that you go down to the Spratly Islands and sit around Pagasa. So why not do it?
Yeah. Would you say it's a pretty lucrative business? Let's say if I'm, a person in China looking to make money, would it be a pretty good interest, a pretty good business opportunity?
As part of a bigger portfolio, I think so. And what we found is that a lot of these people are engaged in other kinds of businesses. They're all mostly locals in the ports from which these operate. These aren't big conglomerates out in Beijing or Shanghai or Nanjing. These are right there in Guangdong, and they might own, a real fisheries boat and also a militia boat. Maybe they own some kind of export-import, facility or whatever, and they're out to make money. And in this case, the government will pay you up to 50% of the cost to build your boat. The local government will then pay you another, say, 25 or 30%. So you can get most of the boat paid for by the government. And then the rest that you take out a loan for, they'll cover the interest. You then get paid regular fuel subsidies, like any other fishing boat would, and a double fuel subsidy up to $4,000 every day that you operate in the Spratlys, as long as you operate for at least 280 days. So this also helps when you think about the crew issue that I mentioned. A regular fishing boat might need 20, 30 crew that you have to pay. If you can pay 8 crew members to go sit at anchor in the Spratly Islands, and you get paid $4,000 every day, and you only have to pay those 8 crew, that's a pretty good way to make money.
Yeah, that brings to mind another question I have, which is, I think it's interesting that you have these certain support structures, right? But come from the government itself, because you have these subsidies that they provide. You mentioned they can cover up to 50% of the cost it takes to build one of these vessels. So it's a known fact in China that the militia exists, and the kinds of activities that it's expected to do isn't a secret. Yet you have, of course, Chinese officials telling the world that there's no such thing as a maritime militia. How do you reconcile these two seemingly conflicting things, and what does it say about the maritime militia itself?
Chinese officials abroad and Chinese academics and think tankers who write these things about the militia not existing are lying. They're lying. In China, it is not hard, as we prove this report, to find document upon document upon document, media report after media report, talking about the militia. In 2013, when all of this modernization program started, Xi Jinping went down to Tanmen Village, which was the village from which the militia vessels that were involved in the Scarborough Shoal standoff in 2012 during the Aquino administration came from. And he thanked them for their service, and he had state media in tow to film the whole thing. They put it up on billboards across the country. And he encouraged other militia units across the country to model themselves on the Tanmen militia who had just helped take Scarborough Shoal from the Philippines. So this has never been a secret in China. Suddenly, in English language press abroad, ambassadors and media pretend that they don't know what the rest of us are talking about when we bring up the militia, but that's a misinformation campaign.
I see. I'm curious, Greg, because you are an expert in the South China Sea dispute. You followed this issue very closely for so many years, and now you've taken just this really deep dive into the Chinese maritime militia. What surprised you the most along the way when you were researching on the militia?
How easy it was to untangle the ownership was interesting. When you look at illicit networks like this, say the boats that operate from northern China who smuggle to North Korea, or vessels that are involved in illegal fishing globally, including the Chinese Distant Water Fleet, usually they're owned by shell companies and more shell companies, and you have to go 20 steps to find out who a real human being is. That wasn't the case here. Nobody was trying to hide anything. And they don't see any reason to hide. They're proud of what they're doing. They're proud of their national service. And so you had 1, maybe 2 steps to find out who the real human being is that owns this boat. I'll flag this also raises an interesting question. One of the boats on our probable militia list, and we didn't put on the confirmed militia list, was the Yue Mao Binyu 42212, which your viewers might remember is the boat that rammed and sank the Gem Bear at Reed Bank 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago now. China has never brought forward the owner of that vessel. Nobody in the Philippines has ever been able to track them down. And yet our research shows pretty clearly that it's not that hard, which means Chinese officials know exactly who owns the Gembear, exactly who operated it, exactly who was responsible for that accident, and they're refusing to share the information.
Yeah, I want to touch on that a little bit because you mentioned in the report that all these findings bolstered, of course, the view that the ship that was involved in Denver's ramming was indeed a Chinese maritime militia vessel. But you mentioned that right now it might be impossible to really confirm at this point. Can you tell us more about that?
Right. So we know that that vessel, the UAML Bennu 42212, operates from a port that has a lot of other militia vessels, Malming Port in Dien Bai District, which is one of the 5 ports that we identify in this report as having a lot of militia. We know that the operator had been involved in government work before. He was paid to do various government work in the past, and we found that in previous research that ANTI, my team, has done. And we know that they have very suspicious AIS signals, so they kind of behave in strange ways. But we've never been able to find a document that specifically says this vessel is a Spratly backbone fishing vessel. We have a whole lot of smoke and no fire just yet. And I think that's largely because the Chinese government and local authorities in Dien Bai have made sure that that vessel disappeared from the record. We haven't seen the 42212 for quite a while. They have every incentive to hide who it really was. And so I doubt that you're ever going to find proof because I think it's been scrubbed. I think that they have every incentive to pretend that this was just a fisherman who somehow, in a 1 in a million chance, hit another boat in the middle of the night.
Hmm. You raised a while ago, well, actually in the report, it was also mentioned the kind of training. There's also a training program, I suppose you can call it that these maritime militia vessels go through to do what's expected of them, when they're out in the South China Sea. And you mentioned a while ago that while they look like fishing fleets, they don't actually fish. What they sometimes do is, do dangerous maneuvers, and in the case of Denver, you see what happens when those sorts of activities take place. So is this a clear violation of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea? Because you also mentioned a while ago that there is support from the Chinese government for these kinds of activities out at sea.
Yeah. The legal regime here is complicated because it depends on what each boat is actually doing, right? Nothing says that you can't drive a boat into the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines and then sit there for 280 days. But what you do while you're out there is what usually gets you in trouble. So you are not allowed to fish. You are not allowed to, engage in unsafe maneuvering. You have to follow whatever the environmental regulations are of the coastal state, in this case, the Philippines, when it comes to all your operations. And clearly the Chinese boats aren't doing that. They're not checking in with the Philippines on what they should be doing. More egregiously, when particularly the professional militia boats, the ones that operate out of Hainan, when they're engaged in protecting Chinese survey vessels, which has happened a lot off the coast of Malaysia and Vietnam recently. And they're purposely cutting across the bows of other boats, purposely harassing smaller supply vessels. That's a violation of not just UNCLOS, but the IMO's regulations on avoiding collisions at sea, the so-called coal regs. It is in cases in which these vessels may be engaged in cases in which the professional militia are engaged in state activity and they're directly under the control of the PLA and the China Coast Guard, then they get into a weird gray zone where we have to decide whether or not they're armed combatants. Should we treat them as parts of the Chinese Navy and Coast Guard, or should we treat them as civilians? And this is itself very muddy. I mean, going all the way back to the Geneva Conventions, we have clear definitions of what is a state actor and what is not. And these guys are supposed to be wearing uniforms and showing themselves to be state actors if they are. If they're not doing that, then they're violating the Geneva Conventions.
Right, but it kind of seems that in that's what they are in all but appearance, right? Because they appear to be fishing vessels out in South China Sea, but then as detailed in your report, there are these ownership structures where sometimes they're linked to a company that's a state-owned company, or they're an official who might be tied to the Chinese government. And so, in terms of accountability, can't they be held? Can't those owners or I mean, because there's support coming from the Chinese government, can they be held accountable for some of the incidents that take place at sea, or not
Yeah,
necessarily?
yeah, they are, the Chinese government is ultimately liable for the behavior of these fleets. In the case of the professional militia, they are directly ordering everything the militia do. So they're, any boat you see that's named Sansha Yu, coming from Sansha City in the Paracels, is under direct state control, owned by a state-owned company and following orders from the state. All the others from the Spratly Backbone fleet, they are following more general directives from the government, but the government has paid them to be there and given them standing orders on what they're supposed to do while they're in the Spratly Islands. So ultimately, the Chinese state is responsible. Whether or not the Chinese state owns every single boat, the Chinese state has paid for them to go do that and told them what they're supposed to do. The question is, how do you impose cost? You can't sanction every single owner of a militia boat. It's not really realistic. I think you could probably go after the state-owned companies. It's realistic to do that because these are state-controlled paramilitaries that are clearly illegal. I think you should treat them the same way you do, say, Russian paramilitaries in the Ukraine. But for the broader group, there's the the issue of diplomatic name and shaming. These are generally commercial actors who see this as a good way to make money. If it stops being a good way to make money, they'll stop doing it. And if everybody knows every Chinese militia vessel on site because we've developed this kind of list that everybody in the region shares, then the militia is really not that useful to China anymore. The whole point is the deniability that if one of them goes too far, like the 42212 did with the Gembear, you can deny it. And if we take away that ability to deny it, then Beijing doesn't have as much reason to continue to rely on the militia.
It's interesting that you mentioned that. I didn't think, or I think it's interesting because sometimes we think that once you make a diplomatic protest, for example, it's addressed to Beijing, and it's something that's far away from people between two governments. But you're saying that it could also end up, becoming a deterrence for Chinese themselves, because if it's suddenly no longer very attractive or worth it to do this sorts of activity, then it could also affect how it how the maritime militia expands, for instance, or whether or not more people will be interested in taking up such an endeavor.
Right. I don't think that a private diplomatic protest does any good here because it gets filed in a drawer in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Beijing and nobody looks at it again. I'm talking about public protest. Well, we saw the Philippine Coast Guard do at Whitson Reef in the spring when the PCG Copper went out 4 times and took pictures of the bow numbers of all of these vessels and published it in international media. And then the Vietnamese Coast Guard followed suit and went out and took more pictures and published it so that people like me and my team and journalists like yourself could dig into who these people are. Once you shine a spotlight on them, then it disincentivizes their use because a lot of these actors, a lot of these militia owners have other businesses. They don't want to be seen as paramilitaries. And for the Chinese state, the value of the militia, again, is its deniability, which is why they try so hard to hide it. It's why they lie to us when we say, isn't that boat a militia? And if you take away that ability to lie, then you take away a lot of the militia's value to China.
Right. You mentioned Whitson Reef, and I think it was one of the most loud events, or one of the most major events that happened in the South China Sea this year. There was a lot of criticism on this from the Philippines that not enough was being done to address that situation. But I think you mentioned it was interesting that this incident, in fact, was very crucial to the report. You mentioned that a lot of vessels were identified from that from their gathering in Whitson Reef. What else did you learn from that event, and how crucial was it to giving this broader understanding of who the Chinese maritime militia really is?
Yeah, so the Whitson Reef was very helpful because it took a lot of boats that were in our probably militia camp and it brought them into our definitely militia camp. Right, we had all these vessels that we had come across in one place or another, and then they were in a photo from the Philippine Coast Guard or the Vietnamese Coast Guard, and we were able to confirm they are 100% a militia boat. They're there operating at Whitson Reef for months at a time, clearly not in commercial behavior. So it really helped expand out that list. It also taught us some important lessons. One, it showed that the militia is not trying as hard to hide itself as we thought. So for many years, researchers like myself, we would look at the South China Sea on commercial platforms for AIS. That's the automatic identification system signals that boats put out. And you would see an empty space in the Spratlys, almost no vessels. And we assumed that was because the vessels were turning off their AIS. But Whitson Reef proved that they're not turning it off. They've just got weaker, what's called Class B transceivers that can only be picked up, say, 100 miles out. So they can't be read by the satellites. But when the Philippine and Vietnamese Coast Guards went out there, they were able to monitor these vessels, which, and there's the reason for that mostly is because as far as these Chinese boats are concerned, they're in Chinese waters, and they have no reason to pay up for the more expensive transceivers that you need for international waters. But it also means that if you get regular patrols out there and, say, build an AIS transceiver on Pagasa and other facilities, you can probably keep 24-hour-a-day track of all of these vessels, at least as long as they continue to broadcast their AIS. And the very last thing it showed us is that the public naming and shaming works, right? After the international outcry got loud enough, the vessels left. They came back, they're back now, but they left at least for a while.
Yeah, I'm interested to know how you see these kinds of boats evolving in the future. You mentioned right now that there are around general situation is there around 300 vessels operating in the Spratlys at any given time of the year, if I'm correct. But do you think that these numbers could grow beyond the number that they currently are in, and even evolve more in the way that they act, or is this all there is to it?
Yeah. So those are our rough estimates. I mean, we've been estimating at AMTI that there's between 250 and 300 militia boats in the Spratlys every day since late 2017, and that's based on all the different remote sensing data we pull. We see all of these boats, and the numbers are roughly the same. For the first year or so after the Chinese islands were finished in the Spratlys, they hung out in the harbors of those islands. From late 2018 on, they spent most of their time around Pagasa. And then starting about a year and a half ago, they started spending more and more of their time in Union Banks, which includes Whitson Reef. So they're moving around, but the overall number seems to be the same. And that 250 to 300 isn't the whole fleet. I ballpark that the whole fleet is probably under 1,000 boats between the professional militia in Hainan and the Spratly backbone fleet in Guangdong. I don't think that number is likely to expand considerably. We haven't seen the 250 to 300 number change over the last, say, 4 years. And while we could see a growth in the professional militia, I think what you're more likely to see is a move toward professionalization. So more of the boats going from Spratly backbone to professional. I actually think it's most likely that over the long term, as the China Coast Guard and the Chinese Navy become more and more effective at their jobs, then there's less reason to continue to rely on these militia. I think the professional militia fleet will continue to play an important role, but the Spratly backbone fleet, it feels like a stopgap measure for Beijing, right? That China under Xi Jinping wanted to establish 24-hour-a-day, 7-day presence everywhere in the South China Sea. And the only way to do that was to rely on commercial fishing boats. So they bootstrapped this new militia fleet called the Spratly backbone fleet. I think if we were to do the kind of public naming and shaming and cost imposition that we talk about in this report and take away the value of that fleet, we would see China move away from it. We'd see them move toward more reliance on state vessels.
Right. I think that's also why you talk about offering a methodology in your report. What does it mean for claimant states, for example, who experience the kinds of activities that the Chinese maritime militia does in their own waters to have the militia identified? How is it a world? Do you think that this is something that countries should actively keep doing, let's say on their patrols? You mentioned, of course, the benefits that this brought during the Whitson Reef incident.
Yes, I think that it's imperative that particularly the Philippines and Vietnam, but also Malaysia and Brunei and Indonesia, help to continually monitor this fleet. We should be moving, and this should include outside allies and partners like the US, Japan, Australia, and India who operate in the South China Sea. When we see these kinds of deployments, take photos. Record your ship-to-ship AIS as you pass them by. Share that data with other coastal states so we can all say, okay, well, this boat that I just saw was off the coast of Vietnam last month doing something suspicious. It won't be that hard to take the 122 confirmed vessels, 174 vessels total if you include the likely vessels in our report, and build that out to the entire fleet. And then every captain operating in the Spratly Islands can have a list right there that says, here's all the known militia actors. If you see one, you don't have to pretend that it's a commercial vessel. And that also helps with the cost imposition on Beijing, because every time one of these actors is involved in a dangerous maneuver, you can easily go to Beijing and cut right through all that BS when they say, what's a militia boat? I don't know what you're talking about. And you can say, really? Because here's the 5 times this year that it's been identified at various spots in the South China Sea behaving aggressively. And if we get that kind of persistent monitoring effort, that's what I think takes away the value of the militia for China.
Right. So it would be in everyone's interest as well to kind of cooperate on this endeavor to identify which vessels are part of the maritime militia and to grow out the list that that AMTI already started. But is this something that would be take a lot of resources, or is it something that's already doable? Given how countries like the Philippines and Vietnam operate, or does it require a lot of resources?
I don't think it'll be that difficult. I think so the step one for me would be to build AIS receivers, ground-based AIS receivers on Philippine, Vietnamese, and Malaysian held facilities in the Spratly Islands, and then share that amongst each other. That'll identify any vessels that are within, say, 100 miles or so broadcasting AIS. The same can be done with Philippine and Vietnamese and Malaysian Coast Guard patrols through the islands, which will get a lot easier as the Philippines begins to forward deploy Coast Guard vessels at Pagasa. Because right now, the Cabra has to go something like 500 nautical miles round trip to and from Puerto Princesa, so it can't be out there very long. But if Philippine Coast Guard vessels start forward deploying at the new harbor in Pagasa, they can be out there all the time. So that's a big part of it. Having them, having kind of a methodology. If you see one of these vessels and it's identified on AIS, snap a photo of the whole number, and then we can all share it amongst each other and look at it. None of that's that difficult. It's things that are already being done for the most part anyway. I think the last piece of this would be getting the external parties like the US and Japan and Australia to help. We already fly P8s over the Spratly Islands with some regularity. We do multilateral patrols. We could build out a multilateral coalition that's monitoring these illegal actors for the purpose of sharing the data with regional states.
Right. I'm curious, Greg. One of my last few questions. Having done all the research that you've done for this report, really detailed, really detailed stuff and use of primary sources and everything. What do we want to find out about the maritime militia at this point that we don't know yet? What are some of the key things that we're still trying to uncover about them?
So for me, a lot of the mystery left is with the professional fleet, not the Spratly Backbone fleet. The Spratly Backbone fleet is probably the largest, but once you kind of figure out what one of them looks like, you know what they all look like. And that's just a matter of continuing to add to the list. I don't think we're going to be surprised about the Spratly Backbone fleet. The professional maritime militia fleet has a smaller presence in our report because there's not as much transparency, obviously. It's owned by the state, it's operated by the state, so you don't get access to as many publicly available documents as you do for the commercial boats. So most of the 52 likely boats that we have are actually members of that professional maritime militia fleet. I'd like to see more work done. I hope to do more work on how many boats exactly are owned by Sansha Fisheries Development Corp, which is the state-owned company that manages the militia, and what kind of operations are they charged with doing? Because we see them harassing foreign oil and gas operations. We see them protecting Chinese survey vessels. We occasionally see them engaging in unsafe maneuvers. They seem to be the ones that are encouraged to really create trouble for foreign operators. The Spratly Backbone fleet is paid to basically go there and sit like they did at Whitson Reef. So they're more numerous, but they're less dangerous.
Right. And I guess as a final question, I want to ask you, so of course now there's an incentive for countries to really go out on patrols and identify these vessels wherever they find them. And and then after that, share it with one another, with different countries. But beyond that, what can we do about their presence in these waters? Because it's one thing to identify them, but what if they're still there
Yeah.
afterwards, and or what comes next after that? What can be done?
On the water, response is going to be hopeless. Um, the China has more boats. Its boats are bigger, and frankly, it's just closer. It's got 3 air and naval bases in the middle of the Spratly Islands, and like I said, the Philippines has to go 600 miles from Puerto Princesa to do a single patrol. Even if it gets one Coast Guard boat posted out to Pagasa, it doesn't really change anything. Trying to arrest 300 Chinese fishing boats that are bigger than you every single day is obviously hopeless. So that is not the answer. Ultimately, it's going to be about monitoring and cost imposition. And you can get to a point where, like, if China really wants to continue to pay its vessels to sit there and do nothing, then that's up to China. But we can, as an international community, make very clear that these are state actors and that they are destabilizing the region and violating international law, and then impose cost on Beijing and other fora. So this is where you get to the broader question of, will the Philippines and other claimants engage in the kind of public naming and shaming again that we saw under the Aquino administration, which has really disappeared over the last 5 years. And I don't know, but eventually somebody's going to have to stand up in the UN and call for a resolution. Somebody's going to have to file another case against China. If it's not going to be the Philippines, then I don't know who it'll be, because I don't think any of the others will do it.
Right. And on that note, we'll be definitely watching these developments closely, and hopefully, governments take a look at the report and use the methodology you offered there to do what you suggested, identify these and share the information with one another. Thank you so much for joining us, Greg. We hope to have you again on the show next time, perhaps when you know more and uncover more about the professional arm of the Chinese maritime militia. We hope to have you again soon. Thank you for joining us,
Thanks,
and see you
Sabina.
again next time on Rappler Talk.